Captured by U.S. forces, Pernass and his comrades were branded spies, a charge carrying the gravest of penalties under the laws of war. As the snow continued to fall, these three men faced a fate that would test not just their courage, but the very notions of justice and morality in wartime. On December 23, 1944, Pernass stood before a firing squad. Witnesses would later recount the haunting calm he displayed, a stoicism that bordered on the supernatural, as he accepted a fate that many could not. Yet, the question lingers: was this execution a matter of justice or an act of vengeance, raw and untempered by the rules of engagement? The story of Manfred Pernass is not just a tale of war. It is a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting the thin line between duty and cruelty, between honor and horror. It begins in the shadows, moves through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and ends in a moment of stark finality that has echoed through decades. The Wehrmacht, battered by relentless Allied advances in France and the Soviet push from the east, was fighting a war it increasingly could not win. Morale was slipping, resources were stretched thin, and Hitler's obsession with turning the tide had reached its zenith. The Ardennes, a dense forest spanning Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of France, became the stage for his last great offensive, a surprise thrust designed to split Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. This was the context in which Pernass operated, a man shaped by the rigid discipline and ruthless ideology of the German military. Born into a world shadowed by the aftermath of the First World War, he had come of age under the Nazi regime, trained in the elite ranks of the Volkssturmgewehr, the German paratroopers, whose skill, daring, and often reckless bravery were legendary. Paratroopers were not ordinary soldiers. They were the shock troops, the precision instruments of chaos meant to strike fear into the hearts of enemy forces. Yet, by December 1944, the war demanded more than battlefield valor. It demanded subterfuge. It demanded men who could become shadows in enemy lines, who could operate without uniformed protection and rely on guile rather than force. Pernass and his two comrades volunteered, or were ordered, for exactly this task: infiltration, deception, and sabotage. Disguised in American uniforms, they carried with them a small arsenal of tools designed not for conventional combat, but for disruption. Their mission was simple in theory: confuse Allied troops, disrupt supply chains, and create chaos behind the front lines. But simple in theory often becomes deadly in practice. The Ardennes in winter was no ordinary battlefield. Snow covered the ground in thick, icy layers, trees were skeletal in the freezing air, and visibility was limited to a few yards. It was a landscape that magnified every sound, every movement, every mistake. Allied soldiers, weary from weeks of relentless marching and combat, were already on edge. Supply lines were stretched thin. Communication lines were vulnerable. In this environment, Pernass and his team were almost invisible, but only almost. One wrong step, one misplaced signal could mean capture. And the consequences for being caught behind enemy lines in enemy uniform were severe. Military law was clear. A soldier found in disguise or attempting to operate as a spy faced execution. It was a rule codified in international conventions, meant to distinguish between combatants and those who sought to deceive, to operate outside the accepted rules of war. Pernass knew this, yet the risk did not deter him. There is a strange courage, or perhaps a fatalism, that drives men like him, a combination of loyalty, training, and perhaps blind adherence to orders. To move forward, knowing the potential cost, is to embrace a shadowed morality, one that history struggles to reconcile. Throughout the Ardennes, the chaos of the offensive created an environment ripe for both heroism and horror. German tanks surged through snow-covered roads, infantry clashed with Allied defenders, and artillery fire tore through forests in irregular bursts. Amidst this turmoil, Pernass's team operated like phantoms. They sabotaged supply depots, misdirected convoys, and even left false intelligence meant to mislead Allied command. Every act was calculated to maximize confusion, every movement designed to evade detection. But such operations carried an inherent tension. The closer they came to their objectives, the closer they came to the risk of capture, and the closer they came to death. For the Allied forces, The sudden appearance of what appeared to be American soldiers causing havoc behind lines was disorienting and terrifying. Rumors spread quickly. Soldiers were unsure whom to trust. Entire supply chains faltered. In the midst of winter, in a battle defined by sudden thrusts and frantic retreats, fear became as lethal a weapon as bullets or shells. Pernass and his comrades exploited this fear with chilling efficiency, their anonymity and deception striking at the core of Allied discipline. Yet even as they moved with precision and daring, the specter of their fate loomed large. For spies, there was no mercy. If caught, the law of war offered no leniency. And the Americans, aware of the risks posed by infiltrators in their uniforms, were prepared to enforce these rules swiftly. The stage was set for a confrontation that was as inevitable as it was tragic. When Pernass and his team were finally apprehended, the weight of their actions, and the unforgiving hand of wartime justice, descended upon them. They were no longer soldiers in the traditional sense. They were spies, accused of operating in disguise, a crime punishable by death. The winter forest, which had so far concealed them, now became a silent witness to their capture, a frozen tribunal that would see them face a firing squad. In that moment, the stark reality of war crystallized. Courage could not always save a man from the consequences of his deeds, and legality could intertwine uncomfortably with morality, leaving only the cold clarity of execution as resolution. December 23, 1944, dawned gray and cold, a sky heavy with snow and the weight of impending death. In a clearing somewhere in the Ardennes, Manfred Pernass and his two comrades were brought before a firing squad. The scene was grim, the air taut with silence, punctuated only by the occasional gust rattling through the skeletal trees. Soldiers, both German and American, watched from the edges of the clearing. For Pernass, this was the moment of reckoning, the culmination of months of training, perilous operations, and moral compromise. Standing there, Pernass displayed a composure that would haunt witnesses for years to come. Accounts describe a man eerily calm, accepting the inevitability of his fate without protest or plea. Some called it courage, others, resignation. Either way, it underscored the chilling nature of war, where discipline and fatalism intersected with the raw, unfiltered reality of death. The charge against him was clear: espionage. Under the laws of armed conflict, any soldier found behind enemy lines in the guise of the enemy, engaging in acts of sabotage, was subject to execution. It was a rule meant to enforce the distinction between uniformed combatants and clandestine operatives. Yet the moral clarity of these laws often blurred in the fog of war. Was Pernass a criminal, a soldier merely following orders, or a pawn in a game orchestrated by generals far from the frozen forests of Belgium? Historians continue to debate the fine line between justice and vengeance in cases like these. On one hand, the execution adhered to military law, a strict interpretation of the Hague Conventions intended to maintain some semblance of order amid chaos. On the other, the human instinct for retaliation, especially in the crucible of war, cannot be discounted. Allied forces had witnessed firsthand the havoc wrought by infiltrators in their uniforms. The confusion, the ambushes, the stolen intelligence. Emotions ran high, and the desire to punish could easily blend with the dictates of law. As the squad raised their rifles, Pernass's demeanor remained composed, almost eerily detached. His calmness was not bravado. It was a final act of agency in a situation designed to strip him of choice. In those final moments, the theater of execution became both a moral and psychological battlefield. Witnesses would later recount that he appeared almost serene, an emblem of the complex intersection between duty, honor, and mortality in wartime. The firing squad did its duty. The shot rang out, shattering the icy stillness. In a forest that had seen countless acts of violence that December, this act would linger in memory far longer than the bullets that fell. Yet, even as Pernass and his comrades fell, their story continued to ripple through the annals of history. Their deaths were immediate, irreversible, and absolute, but the questions they left behind were far more enduring. What responsibility did individual soldiers bear when following orders that demanded subterfuge and deception? Could morality survive under the shadow of war? And perhaps most poignantly, could justice ever truly exist in a theater defined by chaos, fear, and survival?